Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. I am here to just say a few words about the idea for this initiative and the vision behind it. And I'm going to start with a very few words, words that have been on my mind a lot lately. And I keep going back to this and trying to puzzle over this idea. To live in community and self-govern. This is the great promise of democracy and also its biggest challenge. It's a challenge for each of us in life. It's a challenge on this campus every day, and it's certainly a challenge in this country. More than a challenge, it's kind of a paradox, a riddle even, a setup. How are we supposed to do this? To live in community and self-govern. The idea of community prioritizes the collective, our collective wants and needs as a society and as any group. It seems to suggest that the self has to be set aside to satisfy what is best for the collective. The idea of self-governance, on the other hand, promises to satisfy the wants and needs of the individual. It suggests that we should be able to exercise our voice and our will in a way that reflects our own desires. But to truly attain self-governance, it would seem that we need to set aside the collective, living as if in Henry David Thoreau's woods. But we do not live in the woods. Well, some of us do. This is Amherst, so some of us do live in the woods. But for the purposes of democracy, in this country, we live together, we govern together. And on this campus, we seek to live together and work together and learn together. And we do this with many whose beliefs and ideals are in sharp contrast to our own. So how do we do this? Well, philosophers for some time have offered this idea that the key to this paradox of how to bridge this divide between the community and the self is really to make it so that the two align. And the answer is often offered in the idea and the ideal of unity. That really what's required to experience self-governance within this collective. The self has to reflect the whole, and the whole has to reflect the self. It is a tall order right now, I'm aware, but many have forwarded this idea, including our founders, for whom union and unity were paramount. Just hold on to that. It's a pretty old idea. Cicero, in his treatise on friendship, talked about this. When each person loves the other as much as himself, it makes one out of many. The idea was picked up by Enlightenment thinkers who wanted to emphasize the same thing. Rousseau and On the Social Contract. And we as a body accept each member as a part indivisible from the whole. And of course, our founders also echoed this and enshrined it on the seal of the United States, e pluribus unum, out of many one. This ideal and aspiration that the people can act with a single voice and envision themselves as a unit for the purposes of governance, not for every reason, but for the purposes of governance. Now let's go back to this though, because this is going to feel like quite a stretch, and I don't disagree. This idea of unity, to make this our objective, it feels like quite a stretch. We have very, very strong disagreements. We have very, very strong disagreements. One of the things we disagree about most is democracy. We also might not find it desirable. This idea of unity, for some people, this shouldn't necessarily be our goal. We are very different and we like our differences. We celebrate our differences. And so the idea that we're going to erase that for the sake of a unified whole, that for some people is just not desirable. So our objective here is not to settle this debate, whether unity is possible, whether unity is desirable. We are not here to settle this debate, but suggest that there is a different path to resolving the same paradox. And so we're going to replace unity with another U word, and that is understanding. And now I'll just say a couple of words about this, and I know the skeptic in the audience may already be questioning. understanding, this is what we're going to offer here. We came to hear about democracy, and we've got this political scientist standing up talking about understanding. At least give us an algorithm or something. And, you know, we probably do have an algorithm for that. But bear with me, because understanding is actually a very, very powerful thing. It might be the most powerful thing. Colleagues and students will have heard me talk about this as a political strategy. They will have heard me talk about it as a research strategy, a methodological strategy, a specific kind of understanding. And here I draw a lot of my inspiration from a classic in the social sciences, Max Weber, who talked a lot about understanding and a specific kind of empathetic understanding. I am not going to quote from Max Weber here because, as my students know who've been listening to me talk about him for over a week, I can go on for quite a while. But this idea of an empathetic understanding plays a big role in my own work, and I think it has a lot to offer. An empathetic understanding does not mean that you agree with the other's point of view. It does not mean that you approve of it. Very often, you will disagree even strongly as a result of understanding. But even in disagreement, understanding is grounding. Understanding helps you engage in others' worldview, something that our speaker today is going to talk a lot about. Understanding also is not going to do away with our fights. We are going to keep fighting, but that is okay. Fights are these fights over policy and these various issues. These fights are the thing of politics, and politics is good. Politics is what allows us, a nation of over 300 million, to live together. And democratic politics allows us to live together better. And so we want to center this idea of understanding for many purposes, but today as a strategy for democracy preservation. And you might, again, go back and question, well, how are we supposed to do this? If unity is difficult to achieve, understanding is not far behind. Understanding and empathetic understanding is very, very hard to achieve. And we have an advantage here on this campus. Most people living in the world and in this country do not have the opportunity to interact with as many people from as diverse points of views. Here, it is all around us. We have a political education at our doorstep. But we also know from colleagues in contact theory that just being around people is not enough. Just engaging with them, being let loose in unstructured environment doesn't necessarily produce understanding. It has to be structured. It has to be supported. These engagements have to be supported, not because there is anything wrong with us, but because what we are being asked to do is extraordinarily difficult. Go back to that paradox and that riddle, to live in community and self-govern. It's extremely difficult. It is something that does need to be structured and supported. And I believe this is where the university has a role to play. And it's a vital role. It has many roles to play within a democratic society. But one of them, a very important one, is to provide the support and structure, provide the space for us to navigate our way to meaningful understanding, not just for those on campus, but for the whole community. And that is our hope and our desire for this series. And I will say right up front, this is called Democracy in Troubled Times. We at no point are going to stand up here and tell you what democracy is. Again, the skeptic in the audience might be disappointed. They're not even going to tell us what democracy is. But in truth, we cannot tell you what democracy is, because democracy is something we make together. What that balance is going to be between the community and the self, how we are going to navigate that, how we are going to find some sort of resolution that allows us to feel included and whole and represented, that's something that we negotiate every day. That's something for us to reflect on individually, collectively, and to really struggle with. And our aim is to really provide opportunities for this. And so the initiative is broken down into several components. I'll just go over them very quickly because many of these components you'll see here today. We have assembled fairly robust set of courses that touch on this theme. So these are in-class opportunities. There are also opportunities outside of class. There is a reading list, which if it's not up already, will be up very, very soon for those who are not enrolled in these classes to be able to just read on their own, and for community members who might want to do this as well. Reflect. We have a year-long speaker series starting today, and I will introduce our guest, Marc Hetherington, very, very shortly. But we have a very long and robust speaker series. Scholars, practitioners, all sorts of individuals who have a specific perspective on what's happening in the US today and will come here to help us understand it. This is the lineup just for September. We have quite a few events and more even being scheduled. But today we're going to focus on our keynote speaker. But before that, I wanted to also point out we have a number of engagement opportunities. A number of opportunities for you to get involved in a way that supports this kind of understanding. And so one of them is voice and dissent. This is the opportunity for anyone to submit a view that they believe is unpopular or underrepresented on campus. You can submit it anonymously, you can sign it, you can choose to either have it displayed on our website or not. But it is an opportunity for voice without a response. And we will showcase these voices and we will structure it in a way that they can be heard. Another activity, can we talk about politics? These are small group facilitated conversations that will help us get to what it is to have a conversation about politics and what are some of the obstacles to that or to doing it productively. Finally, mobilize, organize also starts today. You might have heard that there's an election coming up and we have quite a few groups that are focused on this that you can plug into, because in the end, we do need to add our voices to those who will help promote the things that we care about in this democracy. And it's part of how we fight within and fight for democracy. I wanted to say also a few words of thanks to our many sponsors and partners. This was a pretty heavy lift all around. We have sponsors and partners across the university, and we're incredibly grateful for their support. But I also wanted to take a moment to thank members of the organizing committee who have worked very, very hard on this. I want to thank the entire organizing committee that we've been doing this for quite a while, and it's taken a huge effort to put this together. But I want to thank especially, I'll start by thanking Dean Reithmeyer for his support of the initiative and the vision for assembling this extraordinary group to make it happen, and for really pushing it ahead at every step and making it a campus-wide effort by reaching out to partners across campus. I will thank also, special thanks to Kathy Roberts Ford, and Jen Lundquist, my partners in crime, my enablers in over-programming. I think we just added an event this morning. Did that happen? That happened. And really just truly excellent, supportive human beings who have worked incredibly hard to make this happen. I'm incredibly grateful. And I will also thank, last but absolutely not least, Saulo De Paula and Michaela Vision, without whom we would literally not be here. We are called an organizing committee, but not a single one of us knows how to organize anything. So without them actually making this happen, we would be probably standing outside under a tree, passing around a bag of chips. But we are not doing that. We are here very comfortable and enjoying this space and this opportunity. So thank you. Really, really sincere thanks to all of them. Finally, more thank yous. There are much more people who've contributed to this within the SBS staff and beyond. We've been having conversations with people all around campus, and they hear what we're doing and they say, how can I help? And many of them have thrown themselves in ways that probably they didn't anticipate a few months ago because this was not on their radar. So I wanted to just say a blanket thank you to many people who've pitched in and who've helped to make this happen. And I think I will stop there with the wind up so that we can get our speaker up here for the main event. And I want to welcome Marc Hetherington, who will be delivering the main remarks today. and introduce. Marc is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He studies the American electorate with particular focus on trust in government and the polarization of public opinion. He has authored and co-authored a number of books over the years. I've put a few of them up there, and they're all excellent. Why Trust Matters, Authoritarianism and Polarization in America, Why Washington Won't Work, and the one he'll be talking about today, Prius or Pickup. In the book, two award-winning political scientists, Marc and his co-author, Jonathan Weiler, they provide the psychological key to America's deadlocked politics, showing that we're divided not just by ideologies, but by something deeper, personality differences that appear in everything from politics to parenting to the workplace to TV preferences, which would be innocuous enough if only we could decouple them from our noxious political debate. This book has been praised across the spectrum. Kirkus calls it a fascinating way to look at the fracturing of a nation assumed to be united. Thomas Mann from the Brookings Institute says it's an exceptionally insightful and entertaining exploration of the roots of tribalism in America and American European society and politics and its ominous consequences for democracy. Larry Bartels, Vanderbilt University, says their book is authoritative, terrifically engaging, and profoundly important. And Amanda Todd from the New York Times says, I highly recommend it to anyone trying to figure out what's really behind these turbulent political times. So we will add to the praise, but first we're going to hear from Professor Hetherington and his remarks from Prius or Pickup.
Well, thank you so much for the incredibly generous introduction. Hopefully I can come through. So one of the things about my work is it's a little more lighthearted than, the implications. What I'm going to be, trying to do is dig down underneath what is really going on in politics. And, these really are troubling times. I mean, we've seen 2 assassination attempts in the last number of weeks. We see rhetoric that seems really problematic and very different. And especially for the students in the room, one thing I want to make clear is this is very different from how it usually has been over the course of time. It's really easy to imagine if you're 20 years old that politics is just like this, except for basically the entire 20th century, it wasn't. We do see roots of this in another time. But unfortunately, it was the time leading up to and the decades after the Civil War. So this is serious business. Now, in trying to dig underneath the surface of this, I'll make light of some things, but I don't want that to leave the impression that this is anything but a really concerning time. So, with that in mind, the key thing that I want to try to answer and for you to have you guys think about is why do Americans feel so strongly about politics today? Even when, generally speaking, they haven't felt that way in the past. If you were to take a public opinion class from 20 years ago, the first thing that you would learn is Americans don't care about politics. Wait a minute, they seem to care about politics an awful lot these days. What's changed? And, I think that the key is in the nature of the partisan divide. Republicans and Democrats don't understand each other because of the things that we have been encouraged to think about politics in terms of. So political elites have laid out, a certain set of debates that are the things that become what divides Republicans from Democrats. Well, what do they look like? And that's one of the things that I want to try to get at here. So one of the things that is going to be critical is thinking about this sort of contrast in styles. That folks on the right and the left are experiencing these days. And so I'm going to show what that contrast in style looks like. So the Democratic National Convention took place just a couple of weeks ago. And this was the way Georgia counted its or cast its ballots.
Georgia, how do you cast your vote? Ladies and gentlemen, hey, everybody get your hands up. Hey, everybody get your hands up. Hey, everybody get your hands up. Hey, we're not going back. We're not going back. We're not going back. We're not going back.
So who among us did not want to be at the DNC during the course of that particular moment? I want you to take that last part, though, we're not going back, and think about it a little bit when we contrast the same roll call of states at the RNC.
Georgia. 59 delegates.
Madam Secretary, I'm Josh McCoon, Chairman of the Georgia Republican Party. Georgia, the Empire State of the South. Georgia, the #1 state to do business in the United States of America.
Yes, it is.
On November 5th, the Peach State will send 16 electoral votes for the once and future President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And today, we proudly cast all 59 votes for President Donald J. Trump.
Pursuant to the announcement of the delegation and the rules and procedures of this convention, Georgia, 59 votes.
So it's not that Republicans can't have fun, but when they do.
But what happened last week when they took a shot at my hero and they tried to kill the next president of the United States? Enough was enough. And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother. Let Trumpomania rule again. Let Trumpomania make America great again.
Well, one thing is clear. I'm 57. Wait, no, I gave myself another year. I'm 56. By having Hulk Hogan on stage, the Republicans are definitely going back. He was a big cultural icon when I was your age. So, the contrast in styles, could not be, sort of more manifest than we saw, here. I wrote this book, Prius or Pickup, several years ago, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I'm seeing this all play out right in front of me 6 years later. And it's really a remarkable change. So the thing that I want you guys to realize, again, is that the political divide between Republicans and Democrats, and it's key that these divides are between Republicans and Democrats, because the parties give us an identity, something to identify with. And this supercharges whatever the beliefs are on opposite sides. So in this sense, we've seen over the years a divide between rich and poor. We've seen a divide between Protestant and Catholic. That's not been all that pleasant, but it's nothing like we are experiencing today. We've seen a divide between North and South. That has been extraordinarily bad. We've seen a divide between young and old. But what I'm going to suggest here is what we have a divide about is something that is even larger than all of those things. It's psychological. It's something that undergirds why one side is not going back and the other side very interested in maintaining the way things have been in the past, interested in making America great again. So what is that that I'm talking about? Now, again, before I get to this, I want to put this in terms of issues. So over the course of time, we think about different party eras, eras that characterize party divisions. And the one that most of the faculty in the room grew up with, or at least much of the faculty, maybe less of the faculty I grew up with, okay, was the one between business and labor. Economic issues. Should we regulate a lot? Should we spend a lot as government, or should we do less of those things? Okay, more government programs or less. But that's really complicated. Should we spend more on this program, that program, highways versus Social Security versus this thing versus that thing? To know where you stand on those things requires you to think about it. Politics takes place in the head. And, the fact of the matter is most Americans weren't interested in thinking about it and worrying about it along those lines, probably in large measure because it was difficult. What we've seen more recently is the development of what we call this worldview party divide, and leads up with a lot of changes that were taking place below the surface in the parties in the late 20th century. But the key thing is they deal with issues that we think about in our guts, or we feel in our guts, rather than really thinking about. We think about the importance of racial equality. We think about the importance of gender equality. What divides Republicans from Democrats involves equality for LGBTQ people, immigration, religion, things like that. The thing that's interesting and for you guys to think about is, many of these issues have, of course, they have centuries-long roots, but the parties were not on opposite sides of them until very recently. And when I say recently, what I'm talking about is the last, last half century. These divides start to spring up, and this is the thing that's going to make all of the difference. So, with this in mind, we end up with these coalitions of groups, white versus non-white, that we have these days, men versus women, religious versus secular, country versus city. Okay, so these are the sort of coalition partners that make up the Republican Party on the one side, the Democratic Party on the other. And what I'm going to encourage you to think about is tradition. One side of this is the powers of the people who are really interested in maintaining existing traditions and ways of doing things, versus, a side that is trying to change things. So, when we think about hierarchies, who's at the top of the racial hierarchy? Well, white people. So if you're white, there are some advantages to maintaining the way things as they are. Same with being a man. Same with religion still sits at the top of social hierarchies in lots of different ways. Okay, so this is the battle. But here's where I want to move this into territory that might be a little less familiar to you, and I think it's really interesting. This party divide creates divides that transcend politics. They're well beyond it. So, and some of these you may have come across, but politics is divided by product choice, tastes in all sorts of different things. So as it relates to food, it turns out that Republicans are bigger fans of American food. Democrats tend to like ethnic cuisine. You think about the restaurants that you frequent. They may, reflect the politics that you have. Some of these things are traditional American things. Some things are running against those traditions. Maybe a Thai restaurant, an Ethiopian restaurant, something along those lines. So if you ever go to a bar, and college students, they never do that. But if you do, if you find yourself in one, see somebody drinking, and maybe not a college student because you guys all drink what's cheap, but if you're drinking something, there's a choice to be made. If you see somebody with a dark beer, it's almost, it's not almost certainly, but it's more likely to be a Democrat, a liberal, than it is to be a Republican. If you see a family with a lot of children, it turns out that conservatives have about 40% more children than liberals do. And if we're talking about the Prius or pickup, we differ in terms of the types of cars that we drive, and I'll illustrate this more. But on the political right, we tend to, on average, drive more big American, sort of cars, and small foreign cars dominate on the liberal side of the divide. So let me illustrate some of these things in ways that I think are kind of fun. So you might remember the Electoral College map from 2012. This is, the red areas are where the Republicans win. The blue areas are where the Democrats win. So freeze this in your mind, for a moment. The 2020 map looks, very much like this. You guys have it? All right. So this is the dog state versus cat state divide, which looks shockingly similar in this regard. Now, I'm from North Carolina, which is in dog country. So, of course, I have a dog, but this is my dog. This is my dog, Riley. And let's see if we can pick some things out about Riley, that might suggest, he might belong to somebody who's on the novel as opposed to a traditional side of the worldview divide that I'm going to talk about. Well, he's on the furniture. That's the case. He looks like he's mildly buzzed with a face. All right. So I've been talking about, this for a while, and he's cute. He's adorable. He's, 20 pounds and, he's just great. Now, my friend Randy Zabel, who I went to graduate school with, whose worldview is very different from mine, but I want to make clear who's my friend. This is his dog. His dog is a wolf. His dog is where? Outside. Randy's dog, not on the furniture, because that's not the way folks do things in, the places where Randy grew up. His dog could eat my dog. His dog could eat you. So, with this in mind, it's a very different, sort of, sense of things. So, dogs and cats and everything. Do you ever walk around your neighborhood and, wonder a little bit? So, this is a house in my neighborhood, the one on the left as you're looking at it. And what are the things that stand out? I should add, it's small, but there's a Harris Wall sign, down there. So I know this is a Democratic household. Is the house a little overgrown? They're not worried about the action going on around here. I mean, there's no lawn. I mean, there are issues, there. Now, the Trump sign, Cops for Trump, that's a lawn. I mean, that is well kept. You got some flower action going on. Look at that, sort of, so, and, if you walk into somebody's office, you might see a neater and tidier office. I'm just going to guess that that person's maybe a little less liberal than the person with the completely disastrous office. That would be my office. So, then like there's this sort of like, fastidiousness or maybe just orderliness is what I would, sort of suggest. Order, not important. Order, definitely important. This extends into music. Now, this is taken from 2014, and this was a Facebook study where they looked at people who liked different musical acts, but then also liked a presidential candidate in 2012. And what we see is the more often Democrats are over here, more often Republicans over here. You see the well-known Jamaican stoner on the left, Bob Marley. Of course, most of the people of color over here, with the exception of the Beatles. And then, of course, you have, white acts, especially the Motor City Madman, Ted Nugent, who always stands out in a crowd over on the political left. These are just very different understandings of, what constitutes good music. It gives you a sense of why Republicans would not have been enthusiastic about Lil Jon at their convention, but were, with Lee Greenwood, who's a more, sort of tradition-minded musician. Now, one of the people who I thought was pretty interesting, this is 2012, data done from Facebook in 2014. We have Taylor Swift, who's, kind of in the middle. Now, Taylor Swift, of course, has become a more politicized figure. She is one of the childless cat ladies, who has emerged in her endorsement of Donald Trump. This was percolating for a really long time. Of course, she's been dating Travis Kelce, the tight end for the Chiefs, which has made her a lightning rod on the political right for, dominating apparently NFL coverage by being on for maybe a minute, during Chiefs games, in total. for each one. So, this has been an issue. She's showing up at these traditional, NFL, types of things. And Donald Trump has something to say about Taylor Swift and her endorsement. You have, again, but the point is that the culture, it's not just about politics anymore. It's about all of these things. Politics is omnipresent. And this is one of the things that makes things very difficult. And it's not like it's not based on things that are important to people. It's the novelty, it's the, wanting to change things versus wanting to, hold things in place. And again, this is going to be more about me because, it's my favorite topic, me. But, we have, where the book started, Prius versus pickup. These are unusually popular cars in Republican versus Democratic districts. We have almost all American pickup trucks in the red districts. And this is not to say that everybody in a red district drives a truck. Everybody drives Accords and Camrys and, things like that. These are things that are unusually popular in these districts. And then, the blue cars, there's even a Saab. Who drives a Saab? That is unusual. There are like 9 of them on the road, and they're obviously all in a Democratic district. So, with this in mind, small, weird, niche-y, or actually expensive versus the other. Now, one thing that my work has spawned is, kind of unfortunate, and that is this. We have a pickup that says it's identifying as a Prius, which again brings into play, this idea that people, ordinary people, not just political scientists, are thinking in exactly these terms. Of course, this is a real burn, for the political right, on the political left. I don't look anything like a Prius, but I identify as one. It's obnoxious in my view, but it is definitely a suggestion that this stuff matters to what divides us politically. And about that Prius, oh, you can't see that. Don't worry about it. Okay. Actually, I'll read it to you. And this is a key point. So conservative blogger Dan Pera on the Prius. All right. And this is a key point. We all know it's the car of choice of liberals everywhere. There is much a political statement as anything. By driving one of these cars, these folks are saying, I care more about everything than you, and you hate the environment and support torture. So the key point that I want to make here is it's not really about people necessarily driving a Prius or driving a pickup. It's the symbolism, of those things. These things stand for something. I don't drive a Prius, but when I see one, it makes an impression. If you sit next to somebody on the bus and they have on, some sort of a country music T-shirt, you're making assumptions about that person's politics, almost certainly. You walk around campus here, you see somebody with water bottles. If they are, the kind that you refill each time, you're making a decision that's different about that person's politics than if it is a water bottle that was just bought at the convenience store. These are messages that people are taking away. Okay, so with that in mind, what I want to get at is what's underneath it. All right, so I've said, what's the key thing? Tradition is one of the things that's key, tradition versus novelty. But what's the role that tradition plays for people? Why do people want to maintain traditions, not change things, even if there are inequalities that are tied up in those traditions? And our take is that it has a lot to do with how you see the world, how dangerous the world is to you. So in 2016, a guy named a Stanford political scientist asked a question that I thought was pretty clever. He asked, which comes closer to your view? Our lives are threatened by terrorists, criminals, and immigrants, and our priority should be to protect ourselves. Okay, so that is one choice that people got. The other choice people got was, it's a big, beautiful world, mostly full of good people, and we must find a way to embrace each other and not allow ourselves to become isolated. All right, so you got to choose. And as you can see here, The people who chose protect themselves, Trump supporters, nearly 80% chose protect themselves. About 15% chose embrace each other. Among Clinton supporters, nearly 80% said embrace each other, and about 15% said protect ourselves. For those of you not familiar, this is a strong relationship. This is a monster, and I think really suggests what is at the root, this dangerous world. There are dangers. But hang on a sec. Does it sound right to you that liberals are just not afraid? That doesn't sound right to me as a liberal who's often afraid, okay? But we're afraid of different things on the political left. This got translated strangely, but let me just point out, so conservatives seem to be more afraid of things that can be personified, okay? So criminals, terrorists, and immigrants. But liberals seem to be worried about certain things. Were liberals more concerned about COVID-19 than conservatives were? Absolutely. So there's that. Are liberals worried about the climate? That is, climate change? Yes. Are liberals worried about things like inequality? Yeah. Are they worried about words and things along those lines that, might be injurious to people? Yes. So what I would say is when we're thinking about what motivates conservative spheres of things, they are personifiable things like criminals, terrorists, and immigrants. It's not like liberals are super brave, but the things that worry them are things that are more systemic. All right, things like viruses, climate, and words and inequality and stuff like that. So, with this in mind, I'm looking for a mantra that people on the political right, conservatives and almost all conservatives now are Republicans. That didn't used to be the case, by the way, but now conservative and Republican is almost synonymous. Same with liberal and Democrat. So the mantra is, the world is a dangerous place, and what do you have to do under those circumstances? This worldview, if the world is dangerous, you have to adopt some coping mechanisms. Okay. And the thing that's going to be interesting here is that the coping mechanisms that the conservatives adopt are going to be things that liberals just don't understand. And that liberals don't do these same things are going to make it so that conservatives are like, I don't get you. Okay. I don't understand why you aren't concerned, about these things. So what we see breaking down here, I mentioned the word hierarchy before. What conservatives are into is protecting the hierarchies that have existed in the past. So a way to think about this is anything that has survived the crucible of time must be of some wisdom. World predictable. You have a clean desk. You have a big truck so that if you get hit by something, it doesn't kill you, and you can imagine that conservative looking at somebody who's driving a Prius and says, hey man, if I hit you with my truck, you're dead. And that's a bad decision on your part. All right. So you just don't get each other, in this regard. So you got to be vigilant. You got to keep us, people who are part of our community, safe from them, those who are in another community. That makes you wary of social change and physical threats. What about the people who are liberals, our worldview liberals, what I refer to as people with a fluid worldview? Well, their mantra is, world's fun to explore. Follow your own path. You don't need to be so wary about strangers. Be more open to new experiences. It's okay to be unconventional. In fact, so flout those traditions. Don't follow them. That's akin to conformity, and conformity is a real problem. Let people be who they are. This idea that people should follow their own path, their personal autonomy, rather than community values. So you can see where, say, the division about LGBT rights might come in. People on the left would view LGBT people as folks who are following their own beliefs and their own impulses and you know, things along those lines. Whereas people on the right are like, well, wait a minute, we have this community norm in place that suggests that people ought not do that. It might be okay to change that, but it might be chaos. And so as a result, we can't be too safe. You know, we probably better, you know, keep that at arm's length. This idea of us versus them, you can see where the immigration debate fits beautifully into this. You know, are immigrants, you know, some folks who might be interesting and exciting and things that will add to the culture, or should we keep immigrants at arm's length because they might be fine, but they might not be in this sense. So, you know, when we get to measuring these worldviews, and this is something I want you guys to think about, these next two slides, because I think that they're really quite remarkable. Of course, I wrote the book, so of course I think that. But, you know, that being aside, this is sort of the crux, because as social scientists, we usually have to measure things to be able to make our point, you know, to provide evidence that it's not just what we're talking about off the tops of our heads, but what the world actually looks like. All right. And so the National Election Study, the American National Election Study, has been asking these questions since 1992. And one of the things I want you guys to look at is, well, I'm going to read you the prompt because it probably is relatively small for you, but I want you to listen for certain words: liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. Tell me if you hear those words when I do the thing. Okay, so here's the prompt that people get when they answer this question, or for these four questions. Although there are a number of qualities that people feel that children should have, every person thinks that some are more important than others. I'm going to read you pairs of desirable qualities. Please tell me which one you think is more important for a child to have. And then you choose between, you're asked to choose between four pairs: independence or respect for elders, curiosity or good manners, obedience or self-reliance, being considerate versus being well-behaved. Any parents in the audience? You want all eight? Yeah, you want all eight, all right? But you got to choose. Which ones do you want the most? And it's, you know, context dependent. When my parents would come to visit, I definitely wanted respect for elders, and I wanted obedience. But when my parents weren't there, I wanted, you know, different things. But so which ones are the things that you really want? So did anybody here? So again, you know, there's nothing bad, you know, about people choosing, you know, certain of those things. Everybody wants all of those things. All right, so that's key thing. So let me ask you, did you hear the word liberal? Liberal wasn't in there. It definitely reflects liberalism, but did you hear the word liberal? No. Did you hear the word conservative? No. Did you hear the word Republican? No. Did you hear the word Democrat? I didn't either. Okay, so look though how it maps onto politics. So what I have here is the percentage of people who are conservative worldview are the dark colored ones. The liberal worldview are the lighter colored ones. And what this shows is the answers to those four questions about desirable qualities in children had nothing to do with partisanship in the 1990s. All right. Politics had not changed yet. The types of things that we were divided about were not connected to those beliefs about desirable qualities in children. But by 2020, if you were fluid, that is liberal in your worldview, almost all of you were Democrats. And if you were conservative in your worldview, almost all of you were Republicans. So in other words, politics has changed in a way that makes these worldviews fundamental to our political choices. And I want to linger on this, you know, for a minute. Can you imagine, you know, too many things that are more deeply held to people than the way they think children ought to be? Right? I mean, that's not something, everybody has experience with children. Everybody was a child. Many people, I'm sure a majority of people have children. These are attitudes that people have that are really central. And if you don't have children, you've probably encountered children, you know, at some point during your life, and you have a sense about, you know, the level of hierarchy that ought to exist between parent and child. Because isn't this what those questions actually ask us about? Independent kids who are curious and self-reliant and considerate, their understanding of the world, people who think that about children, it's horizontal. Nobody's higher than anybody else, right? But people who want respectful kids who have good manners and are obedient and are well-behaved, there's a hierarchy, to the belief about who's in charge. Who's in charge? Parents are in charge. Kids, not so much. They should listen, okay? So you can see what these questions reveal. These questions, though, reveal not just your partisanship, they reveal so much about people's policy preferences. I just list, a bunch of them here, but they reveal people's racial attitudes. People with more liberal worldviews are much more positive towards people of color than people who have conservative worldviews. Immigration preferences are fundamentally different between people who have liberal versus conservative worldviews. Gender equality, the same way. Gun control, LGBT issues, constitutional interpretation, support for civil liberties, beliefs about science. These are all the things that divide us deeply these days. Do people just have a casual opinion about race? No. People really care about it. Do people just have a relatively casual impression of how much we ought to spend on Medicare? Yeah. I mean, who cares? A little bit more, that sounds good. But about race, people really care. And these are the things that are explained, that are undergirded by our worldviews, okay? And not only that, they permeate everything. The people who have more conservative immigration preferences, they also tend to be the folks who live in the suburbs or exurban areas. People who tend to be more likely to be positive about LGBT people, they tend to live in a place that is, in the cities around where there's more diversity and more places to choose restaurants. And isn't this interesting? Because if we ever want to overcome our differences, which I'll get to in a minute, it gets a lot harder because the same impulse, our worldviews that help us understand our politics, also help us decide where we want to live. What is the right community for us? And we're not living near each other. And that makes it really hard for us to reach common ground and such. There are lots of things. The other thing that's really interesting about this is, partisans have come as the worldview divide has developed. They've come to hate their opponents, okay? So what I've done here is taken these survey questions from the National Election Study that ask people to place, to rate on a feeling thermometer from 0 to 100, from 0, I hate a group, to 100, I love a group, with 50, I'm neutral toward a group in the middle. And the blue line that's not broken is Democrats' views of the Democratic Party. So since the Carter years to the Trump years, have Republicans and Democrats gotten any more loving of their own party? No, 70 something degrees usually. It's, you don't want an EKG that looks like that. Doesn't get you very far. Those are flat lines. Republicans like Republicans a lot. Democrats like their party a lot. But what's happened when, many of your professors were growing up, Republicans didn't hate the Democratic Party. That's the broken red line. And Democrats didn't hate the Republican Party. Remember what I told you about 50 degrees? That's neutral, But what's happened since the turn of the 21st century as worldviews have become central to why people are partisans? Well, we've come to hate the other side. Now, the average feeling thermometer score that Democrats give Republicans is about 20 degrees. It's actually a little below now. The average feeling thermometer score that Democrats give Republicans is a little under 20 degrees as well. That doesn't, 20 degrees sounds cold. You guys are in Massachusetts. It's not even that cold to you. But what does that mean? Well, if you look at other average scores that have been basically that low, the National Election Study has been asking these types of questions for a long time. But to find averages that low, you have to go back to the 70s. And the questions that the NES asked about were people who riot in the streets. They got an average score of about 15. And marijuana users, also in the early 70s, also a mean of about 15 or 20. So in other words, Republicans and Democrats today feel the same way about the other party as people in the 1970s thought about people who riot in the streets. All right, so that's bad, at least in my view. And, you know, when you don't you don't understand the other side, you know, they seem scary. So what this slide says in very small letters is majorities of Republicans and Democrats report the other party makes them feel afraid, angry, and frustrated. Majorities think that the other party's policies are so misguided that they threaten the nation's very well-being. You know, when I was growing up in the 80s, nobody thought that. You know, Republicans lived on your street, Democrats lived on your street. They didn't seem like they were going to bring the republic down, or at least not in most people's views. But that is the way that most Republicans and Democrats view the other side these days. And I'll point out, you know, someone who works here, an old friend of mine, Alex Theodoridis, he warns us about the resulting dehumanization that takes place when people hate the other side. You see partisans of one side calling partisans of the other side things like garbage, things like rats, things like dogs, and so forth. This dehumanization, and this is the kind of thing that, you know, in military training, people do to their troops so that they'll kill the other side, in this sense. And with that in mind, no wonder Theodoridis is known in political science circles and more widely as the greatest Greek political scientist since Aristotle. There's no doubt where that came from. Now, that being said, I want to put in a plug for polarization as well. You guys are growing up in this time that it's really just unpleasant. Okay, it's just, you know, it's unpleasant. But if I'm right about what the roots of polarization are, you know, and what I'm saying, the roots of polarization resulted from, among other things, is a successful push for equality for people of color, women, LGBT people, and so forth. You know, what are the polarizing issues? It's about whether these long-running hierarchies that have existed, you know, and have been the tradition in American life, whether they belong or whether they ought to be challenged and upset. And, you know, what I would say is, to those who belong to those groups, would you rather be members of those groups in the pre-polarization period in the 1950s and the 1960s as a woman, as a gay or lesbian person, as a person of color, or would you rather be a member of one of those groups today? And what I would suggest then is, were those fights that have created this polarization, have they been worth it on a policy level? And I think a lot of people would say, yes, they are. However, it also has downsides, which is concern about really the fundamentals of democracy. You know, so if you're conservative and you see all of these pervasive changes taking place in American life, and it must seem dizzying, the pace of change, all of the things that I, you know, laid out to you have happened in the past 50 years, the past 60 years, these huge changes to hierarchy. Not only, you know, we used to be divided by religion, but religious denomination. Everybody believed in God, you know, in the United States. Even that's not true these days. You know, if you are somebody who values tradition, values the way things have been, this must be a really dispiriting and disquieting time. No wonder you want to make America great again. You want to go back to this other time, even if it's imagined. That's what you want to do. And this is something I want you guys to keep in mind. Understand, going back to Amel's point, understand where the other side is coming from. You don't get it because that's maybe not how your worldview is. But understand how discomforting some of the changes that you embrace are to those who are experiencing those changes in a different way. Okay, so, you know, the next question that I ask is, you know, can we escape worldview politics? And, you know, what I say is that's unlikely in the short term. Polarization actually has historically been more been the rule than the exception. party leaders today have little incentive to change the approach with both sides just tied. You know, Republicans and Democrats are, you know, it's a 50-50 situation in the House and in the Senate and in the Electoral College. If anybody changes, that's a big risk. You know, I'm going to do it differently. That might work, you know, but it might not, you know. So, you know, you might be, you know, putting Donald Trump and the Republicans in office for, you know, decades if you change in a way that doesn't work, or vice versa for the Republicans. But change is possible. And what I want to point to is the possibility of a new generation of leaders who just do things differently. And, you know, one of the foci I want to make here is your generation, young people's generation. You know, what is the possibility that young people might just do it differently? And that's why I want you guys to keep in mind, young people to keep in mind, that it hasn't always been this way. 50, 60, 70 years ago, or even 30 years ago, politics was much, much different. And it's not like you're stuck with this. The key thing is realizing that what divides Republicans from Democrats determines how deep those divisions are going to be. Now, I'm going to leave you with a story that I think captures this very well, and it's going to take us back to the moon landing in the late 1960s. Everybody wants to go back to the moon landing, but the point is that this takes us back to another time when things were different. All right. So you guys have probably experienced something like I experienced in 2004. You know, you got forced to go someplace that you didn't really want to go. I just moved to Vanderbilt University, where I taught for 15 years. You know, I just moved and I had two little kids that were under 4. And life sucked. And, you know, you're just hanging on. I see a lot of nodding from people who have ever had kids under 4. And it was really hard. But I had to go to a talk. And there was a speech being made by a guy named Ron Suskind. And Ron Suskind is an author, used to be a New York Times, Wall Street Journal reporter, wrote a number of really good books. He was giving a talk on campus, and I was his guy for the thing. And then I had to go to lunch or dinner at the chancellor's house afterwards. And, you know, when you're exhausted from having little kids, you really don't want to do that. But, you know, you never know what's going to happen when you go to a talk. And Suskind tells this story at the end of it, and it gives me optimism. And it's something I want to share with you guys before, you know, I finish up. So he grew up in Delaware, which is, who cares? But anyway, he grew up in Delaware in a split level house. And if you guys aren't familiar with a split level house, you know, split level house has, you know, most of the first floor of the house is underground and the second floor of the house is above. And it's the day of the moon landing, and he has a brother who's you know, around his age, a couple years older, and his parents. And they're watching in the basement of the split level house, and the moon landing's about to happen, and everybody in the country is watching this. I mean, you can imagine what the electrical grid was going through in 1968, 1969, 1969 America. So the power goes out, and, you know, they're like, you know, a half hour from the touchdown, and the power goes out. And, you know, if you're in a split level house when the power goes out, it's seriously dark. Okay. It's seriously dark. So, you know, Suskind, you know, they look to his dad, you know, who's like, you know, the patriarch, you know, old World War II dad. And he puts out his arms from his chair and he says, come towards me, you know, everybody. So everybody staggers through the thing and they find his dad, and they go up the stairs and they look out, and the whole block is out. You know, there are no lights. So the lights are done in the neighborhood. They can't go to a neighbor's house to go check it out. So what are you going to do? Well, they look to the dad because, you know, the dad, you know, he's a World War II dad, and he says, get in the car. We're going to drive to the light. All right. All right. So the kids, you know, get in the car. Of course, they're in a carport. You know, he puts it into reverse, pulls out as fast as he can. You know, and the kids have their jammies on, you know, so you guys don't remember this because you were negative 30 years old, but cars didn't used to have seat belts. So they're in the back seat of a car without seat belts, with vinyl seats. Probably they're going back and forth. The kids are back and forth. Probably their jammies are about to burst into flame because they're made of petroleum products. But they don't. And the dad is just driving like hell, and the mom is worried. She's like, "Oh, come on, slow down, slow down." This is what Susskind tells it. "Where are you going? What are you doing?" "We're going to drive to the light. We're going to drive until we see light." And they're driving out of the neighborhood into very unfamiliar territory, and going up hills, down hills, over one hill. Susskind reports, "We got some air," because they were going that fast, and the kids are awesome in the backseat. The mom's a little worried. The dad just like gets more locked in because it's like a bomber that he was on in World War II. So anyway, they all of a sudden they get to a place where there's all of a sudden light. So now remember, they're not in their neighborhood anymore. They're nowhere near anybody that they know. And what does he do? Well, he pulls up in front of the house, probably puts 2 tires on the front lawn. And he says, "Everybody get out of this. We're going to go ask the people if we can come in." And so they knock on the door, and the person invites them in. And they go down to their basement of their split level house, and they see the moon landing. And everybody's there, and liberals, conservatives, Republicans, and Democrats in that Delaware home all embrace each other. All right. So, my question, for you all is with this, this story in mind, can this new generation, can you guys drive us to the light? Because man, our generation didn't pull that off. And we're in need, of a shot in the arm. Keep that story in mind. We don't have to be aliens to each other. We don't have to be garbage to each other. We don't have to be rats. We can just be people. But it takes getting to know them. It takes taking a chance and not stereotyping about what it means that that person is driving a pickup, or what it means that that person's got a George Strait t-shirt on. Thank you very much. I'm happy to do whatever.
Surrounded by.
Oh, sure. There you go.
Wait, Sala has another.
Oh, good.
Questions? Okay, let's start with you.
So you mentioned that you think the polarization began with the push for equity. I'm curious what you think about, have you ever read the book Hate Incorporated by Matt Taibbi?
I've not read it, but I'm vaguely familiar with it. And maybe you can tell me a little
It's
bit.
basically the concept of the polarization began with a push in media for polarization.
Mhm.
I'm curious what you think of that.
Well, so one of the things so great question, so we all experience media, right? Social media, partisan ideological media. And what we know is that those organizations all have incentives to divide us. Why? Because people pay more attention to things that are threats. There are surveys, or there are studies done in political science, and they're based on psychological stuff that show that negative information gets weighted 5 times more strongly than positive information does. So if your bottom line is based on who is going to get more clicks, then you want it to be negative. You want it to be polarizing. There's no question about that. So is media part of this? Absolutely. But what I would say is it reinforces divides that have been created already. I would say this, that even though those incentives are, we didn't used to have partisan news. We didn't used to have social media. We didn't used to have those things during the moon landing. So there's that. But how divided could we have gotten about, how much spending we ought to do on Social Security or highways, or lots of, what the government defense, what the government, really does. So it's a combination. It's these new issues, and then it's amplified, by, this media environment that is that capitalizes on that human characteristic. Great question.
Thank you for that chat. Excuse me. So the definition of liberal and conservative that you're using, as I understand, is basically the same thing that the Democrats and Republicans define themselves, right? Republicans want to conserve change. Democrats want to make change, right? And that worked for a while, right? But last year, there was a poll that came out, which I think reflects this trend that you're talking about, from Gallup, which says 63% of United States people want a third party, which means there's about 2 times as many people in this country who want a new party as people who are content with the Democrats and Republicans. So my question has to do with this other group of people, this large group, which is in the Green Party, is in communist and socialist parties, is even in the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party, whatever, right? The people that used to riot in the streets and smoke weed at the same time.
That's true. They did it at the same time.
They did. That's right. That's
Yeah.
why you got
They were
arrested.
multitaskers.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course. And there were some other multitaskers here, right? Those who were arrested at this campus last semester for peacefully politically demonstrating in favor of ending this university's connections, direct involvement to the genocide in Gaza that Israel is committing there.
Yep.
So that perspective, to be against the genocide and the United States' involvement in that, is not something that the Republicans or the Democrats support. You know, they give lip service to it occasionally. What does your explanation, your theory of political polarization say about that 63%? And by the way, that poll was taken before October 7th. I'm sure that number's gone up quite a bit. What does your theory say about us communists, us Green Party, us libertarians? And is it really a democracy that we've all kind of been assuming that we're in a democracy? Is it really a democracy when you don't even have 50% of the people who feel like the 2 only allowed parties, you know, represent them?
It's a great question. You know, one of the things that I find fascinating, and I'm going to go through a few things, you know, that might, you know, sound familiar to you all. So 63% of people want a third party in the United States, and that seems like a lot. I suspect that when I got my PhD in 1997, same percentage, you know, was the case. We always want more choices. We you know, tend to want that. But the key thing is the political system that we have. It's not that we wouldn't rather have more choices. We would. I know I would. If we had in the United States a different political system, that is one that didn't have single member districts with first past the post elections, we'd probably have 6. We'd have a religious party, we'd have a whatever party. The key thing is that we are in a state where we have the election system that we have. And for those parties with, or the people with different ideas, maybe they're organized in the parties, you know, maybe they're not, but it's going to get ignored because there's no way for those ideas to gain representation in our political system. So what ends up happening is people who have outside of the mainstream views, what are viewed as outside of the mainstream views, ones that the parties aren't able to manage, either they have a decision to try to change one of the parties or to drop out. That's basically the only choice in this particular system. We have seen partisan change happen once where a set of ideas was being ignored by both of the major parties, and that idea was slavery in the 1850s. And the Whigs and the Democrats were both trying to suppress the issue in a way similar to, say, the situation in Gaza. Both parties are trying to ignore that issue as best they can. And we ended up with the emergence of the Republican Party in 1858, 1859, win the presidency in 1860 as the anti-slavery party. It's happened once. And the reason it's only happened once is because we have a single member district, first past the post election system. If this were in Europe, we would have parties that are accommodating, you know, those beliefs. But if you can't win an election, that is, get a plurality of votes in a district and hence get representation, you know, you're ignored. In 1992, we had a third party candidate, Ross Perot. That third party candidate, Ross Perot, got 19% of the vote. That's a lot of votes. You know what representation he got? None. You know, there were no Ross Perot party people in Congress. He won no electoral votes, and the system is rigged against that. And, you know, we can make arguments about whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. But it's frustrating if you're one of those folks who doesn't feel like they fit into one of those two major blocks.
Excuse me, sir. I'll come around.
It's coming your way.
Yep, sorry. Here you go.
Thank you.
Of course.
Roe v. Wade gave the religious right a cause. However, there was no power there until the ERA argument with Jerry Falwell and the religious right. They came out saying that it's a biblical thing that women are subservient to men. And now you have the Federalist Society, where they want to interpret the Constitution as originalism. And I come from a period where this was not done. I come from the time when you were talking about people didn't hate each other.
Yeah.
But I think what we're not paying attention perhaps is the rise of Christian nationalism, which embraces all of these issues you're talking about.
Yeah, so organized religion, and especially not just organized religion, you know, what we think of as evangelical Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity, and in its most extreme form, you might refer to as Christian nationalism, is a force that really was not part of American politics until, as you point out, the Roe versus Wade decision, and before that, Engel versus Vitale, which, you know, provided us with the school prayer prohibitions in the 1960s. And I think you're right. You know, if there's anything that we can learn over time, when political disagreements have been at their most extreme, religion is often part of it. You know, you can go back to the Middle Ages and, you know, think about the Crusades. You can go to Ireland and think about, you know, the Catholics, you know, versus the Protestants, you know, because these are two, you know, identity groups or groups of people with different identities, you know, that really organizes their, you know, their beliefs and their thinking. Now, what's different about today is, you know, if you're someone whose religious faith is on the evangelical fundamentalist side of things, it must be incredibly distressing, you know, to think that, you know, what is it, about 40% of people under the age of 30 are non-believers as it relates to, you know, just not just a God, but not just a Christian God, but, you know, God itself, not going to church. It must feel like, you know, the country is under siege under these circumstances. And I think one of the things that's just really important for us to be mindful of is, you know, if your world felt like it was under siege, you'd probably fight back as hard as you possibly could, no matter what. And that is, you know, what's going on, I think, in the movement on the Christian right. You know, we've seen all of these changes, you know, regarding religious observance, gender, as you point up. You know, a lot of the anti-equality stuff is based in biblical scripture, things along those lines, and it's creating a really difficult, you know, moment. But it's also predictable. You know, it's also predictable. You know, and the groups that you're talking about, just to tie this back to the talk, if you're a religious conservative, you know, what are your preferences about your kids? Is it to be obedient, well-behaved, respectful? Yeah. And are you most concerned about, you know, these kids that are making their own decisions, you know, independent, not even going to church, you know, as it relates to it? So I think it's a great observation.
You mentioned that the divide in the 20th century was primarily around these economic reasons, and that recently they've become more cultural, and this is aligned with the polarization. But that you'd have conservative Democrats and you could have a liberal Republican. So if one was to ask those same child-rearing questions to a hypothetical 1960s, 1970s panel,
yeah,
would you find that same division between the liberals and the conservatives, as opposed to just because the Democrats and Republicans, since they would be ideologically mixed. They would.
So it's a great question, and the answer that I want to give you is like 45 minutes long, but that wouldn't be good. But the answer is it depends on what you mean by conservative. So if you mean by conservative, protecting traditions and hierarchies and stuff like that, then yes. But if you're talking about how much we ought to spend on Social Security, we ought to spend less, we ought to tax less, we ought to regulate business less, then no, because those things, aren't a philosophy about life. Those things are a philosophy about government. And my argument is, people will follow along with parties about those kinds of things, but they don't have independent feelings, about those types of things. They have to follow the party to figure that out. But do they have, their own beliefs about race and gender and sexual orientation and stuff like that? Well, yeah. But those are the tradition-minded things. Politics is a lot easier now. You don't have to think about it very much. You can just feel it. Great question.
So this is going to sound very cynical because I think a lot of people my age probably are quite cynical about this, but I think the idea that, by trying to understand other people's perspectives more, and by trying to approach people with compassion, understanding their perspective, that we can try to heal some of the partisanship in our country sounds like a very hopeful idea. And I think to a lot of people my age, it sounds also impossible because to some degree, I think a lot of people, I'm going to phrase it from my perspective. My perspective is somebody who feels very strongly aligned with people very far to the left, right? Would say that people far to the right don't believe that certain people of our identity should exist at all, or be given any power or any voice in our democracy. And by that metric, it's very hard for us to have a civil conversation with them because we think that they believe that we shouldn't exist, that we shouldn't have any voice, that we shouldn't participate in this democracy. And I think I would also say that looking back to times during the 20th century, a lot of those people also didn't have a voice at all. And so, the situation that we were operating under was a case when, people of certain identities just didn't have a voice. Yeah. And so it was a lot easier to have these civil conversations because people who were outside of the norm of normalcy just didn't have a voice. You didn't have to talk about that. I think you could look to places like Norway and Scandinavian countries, which are also very homogenous. They've succeeded a lot more in having civil conversation because of homogeneity. And so I think I would just like to hear, how do you propose that we have civil conversations or try to promote civility and understanding in this country when we are A, not homogenous, and B, we have a really huge diversity of views, some of those views believe that some other people in that discussion should not be in the discussion at all.
It's a really complicated thing, and I feel where you're coming from about this. I went to a talk at UNC not long ago, and someone asked a similar question to an activist who goes into various unwelcome where he's unwelcome spaces and tries to talk. And the first thing that he said in response to a similar question is, don't go any place or engage in any conversation that you feel uncomfortable yourself with. If you feel like it's going to endanger you in some way, don't do that. That's not a winner. But one thing that I guess I would say is so much of why we believe certain things is based on a stereotype. So one of the points that you suggested is people who are on the other side don't think I should exist. Okay. And the question is, how many people on the other side don't think you should exist? Is that a large number? Is it a growing number? Is it a small number and a decreasing number? All right. So I'll just use, I'll use racial attitudes as an example here. So when I started to teach polarization stuff, the thing that I would always ask at the beginning of my parties classes, when you think about party X, what do you think about? And that used to work just fine until starting in about 2008, Democrats all said, well, the other parties, they're racist. because that was becoming they're a bunch of racists. But if you look at the data over time, Republicans haven't grown more racially resentful. Republicans haven't grown have more racial animus towards people of color. They seem willing to go along with a candidate who expresses some incredibly reprehensible things, but that's not to suggest that they don't think people of color should exist. There's a sense in our minds that if you vote for Trump, you must believe that, but it's actually not true. And in fact, it's decreasingly true. And one of the things that has changed, there is a widening difference, whether it's on gender, whether it's on race, whether it's on sexual orientation. Republicans and Democrats are farther apart, but in none of those cases is it because Republicans have grown more conservative. Republicans' attitudes about these things are a straight line over time. Democrats are way more liberal on all of these things. And I think that makes liberals, Democrats think, well, they're not like me. But it's funny, it's liberals who are changing. It's not necessarily conservatives. So that's what I would keep in mind. It might be a picture that you have or we have in our collective heads about, whether talking with this person who disagrees with me politically is a safe person to talk to. My sense is that in many of these cases, we'd be pleasantly surprised. And maybe too, and just to get to your other question, we don't need to talk about politics all the time. What if liberals and Democrats just went out and built a house together, or got involved in something that didn't have to do with politics? What we would probably realize is we're not as different on these things as we think. But it takes a big leap. It really does.
Sorry, Mark. We have just a little bit more time left, and I wanted to make sure that we have participants online.
Yeah.
So I wanted to read off a question from one of our online participants, and it's a long question, so I've truncated it just a tiny bit. But this individual asks, in your presentation, you've reinforced stereotypes about members of both political parties without addressing that Democrats, through Kamala Harris, have actually shifted their discourse towards one of unity over division and joy over hate. And B, you don't address how people are not simply scared of the other side, but people are afraid of T and MAGA's attacks on very fundamentals of democracy, as in what is laid out in Project 2025.
Yeah, these are really good points, especially, the second piece. The sort of governing blueprint, Project 2025, that the Heritage Foundation puts together, is, a serious, sort of thing about what Republicans would try to do when put into office. I would separate this into two pieces. If we were to take a sample of Republicans and ask their support, whether they supported or opposed many of the more, sort of extreme parts of Project 2025, which we're hearing about, I think there would be limited support, even on the political right, for those things. Of course, that doesn't matter, in a policy sense, because political elites, the folks who put together Project 2025, can pursue these things without legislative fixes in many cases. So it could be, sort of only an elite level, sort of thing. So I'd like to just separate, those two things. Ordinary people are not as extreme as elite level policymakers, office holders, people who work for the Heritage Foundation and stuff like that. As it relates to perpetuating stereotypes, I hope the one thing that comes across in the work is this. I'm identifying these differences that exist because those are the things that are in people's minds about when I see somebody with a certain shirt or a certain symbol attached to them, what that means about them. All right. It's us that have those stereotypes. And what I'm suggesting is we probably shouldn't make that be our last thought about that person. It might be that person, and in all likelihood, that person is much more like us than the stereotype we have in our mind about that person. And so I hope that, in using these stereotypes, that's what, comes across. It's what we're thinking about. We can't ignore it. If we just ignore it, is it going to go away? No. But by embracing it, by leaning into it, it might provide us with a way forward.
And that is a terrific note to end on. So thank you all for being here. We have more programming coming up, but let's thank Professor Hetherington for a great talk.